Welcome to EMBODY, the show where we look at living well through mastering body, breath and mind. Now this episode is on mastering stress, breath and mind, where we break down the science of stress. So that's mastering stress, breath and mind, where we break down the science of stress, resilience and everything in between. Now I'm your host, Christopher G, and in this episode we're diving into one of the most fascinating and misunderstood topics out there, stress. What is it? Why does it matter? And how can we actually work with it instead of letting it work against us? So let's start breaking it down, having a really good look at what it is and how to work with it. Now the first thing is that stress isn't just one thing. It's actually a whole spectrum of experiences. And to make sense of it, I'm going to walk you through 4 useful ways to think about stress. And these categories help us understand how stress shows up in our lives, why it happens, and how we can manage it using tools like, well, you guessed it, didn't you? Your body, breath and your mind. Now, if we start with the basics, there's environmental stress. And environmental stress comes from the world around us. It's things like not getting enough food or water, being too hot or too cold, climbing high up in a mountain, so altitude if you climb high up in a mountain, or diving deep underwater. Now these are the kind of situations where your body is physically challenged to stay in balance in what's called homeostasis in biology. Now here's the fun part. A little environmental stress can actually be really good for you. Well, in this case, ever heard the phrase, what doesn't kill you make you stronger? It's not just a cliche, it's actually science as well, because small doses of that kind of environmental stress, like jumping into a cold plunge pool or doing intense exercise, can trigger what's called hormesis. And hormesis is the benefits that come, the resilience benefits that come from sublethal stressors. That's a sublethal stressor. It's not going to kill you, but it's challenging your system to the degree where your system adapts to that and starts to get stronger because of that and starts to become more resilient. Now, here's the kicker though. Too much of this stress for too long can push your system to collapse. Think of it like tuning a guitar string. A little tension creates music, crank it too tight and it snaps. So if we're going to understand hormesis, we have to understand restoration as well. And restoration is a critical human function whereby we give ourselves time and space for the system to restore well. So with environmental stress and using environmental stress as hormesis, we have to also understand restoration. So that's a little bit about environmental stress. Now the next one is developmental stress. Now developmental stress is a little bit heavier, to say the least, because it's the kind of stress we experience during childhood, especially during those key times up to the age of 8, say for example, when our brains, emotions and bodies are still growing, and also during adolescence, of course, in that highly neuroplastic phase of adolescence. Neuroplastic means the brain is changing. It's changing its function. It's rearranging the synapses, the connections between nerves in the brain to enable different perspectives, different stories, different narratives, different ways of being. And the first 8 years of life are highly neuroplastic. Adolescence is highly neuroplastic. Now, during childhood, during those times, things like trauma, abuse, and neglect as well, where we don't get what we need. We're not getting the attention or the care that we need. And things like, the attrition, the constant attrition of shaming and diminishment. So that's trauma and abuse, neglect, constant shaming and diminishment. They can leave a lasting mark on how we develop and how we navigate life because they change our brain. Because we're in that neuroplastic period, it's changing the way our brain is functioning in those early times. Now, if you read Robert Sapolsky, or look at his YouTube, in fact, and Robert Sapolsky, by the way, is an absolute legend as far as I'm concerned in neuroscience. And he talks about how childhood adversity does not just affect individuals. It ripples out and impacts entire cultures, entire societies. If you look at the impact of transgenerational trauma, which goes from a child who becomes an adult onto the next generation and the next generation, it becomes an incredible problem that we as humans are just at the beginning of dealing with. Now, here's where it gets tricky though. We do need challenges to grow. Like, if you look at a tree that doesn't get any wind grows weak roots and it falls over. As soon as the wind comes, it falls over. So we need challenges to grow. We need to take risks. We need to learn to solve problems, and we need to learn to face setbacks and complexity. But there's a huge difference between healthy challenges and harmful ones, because healthy challenges build resilience, and we can see that in terms of the behavior in an individual, and we could also see it in terms of brain function through scanning the brain. Now, harmful stress at this time, like abuse, neglect, constant diminishment, it can derail development entirely. So if you've ever heard someone say, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," when talking about childhood trauma, that is nonsense. With environmental stress, maybe. With developmental trauma, no. It's not that simple. Developmental stress needs to be the right kind of challenge, not extremes, not abuse, not neglect. Now, what happens in a child's brain when it is facing into extreme complex situations such as abuse, being shouted at, being hit, being beaten, or anything like that, or neglect where its needs are not being met, and those include attentional needs. I see so many kids these days where their parents are on the phone the whole time, not giving the child what it needs, and not getting the attention it needs. And human brains grow in a soup of attention. When we're attended to and responded to, the brain responds. We are communicative. We are relational. We grow in that soup of attention. What happens in those situations where there is abuse and neglect and the child is stressed continually and consistently over time? The brain releases a lot of a hormone called cortisol, which we're going to have a look at a bit later on. And cortisol changes the way the nerves grow. It reduces what's called myelination. You don't have to remember these names, by the way, but it's kind of like they're fatty sheaths around the nerves. And they allow fast traffic communication. They're like motorways between cities, so they allow fast traffic communication between different parts of the brain. And without that fast traffic communication, what happens is that bits of the brain just don't talk to each other as well. So, for example, the emotional part of the brain, the emotional network in the brain, the limbic web of the brain, doesn't talk as well to the bit at the front. And that means we can't then, later in life, pull ourselves out of emotional complexity. We just react to situations. And that kind of reactivity that can occur is largely coming out of childhood abuse, childhood trauma, childhood complexity where the brain didn't grow well. And curiously, if you look at prison populations, the majority of people in prison, first of all, they're men, but the majority of these men also went through high levels of childhood adversity, which means their brains grew in a soup of complexity where it's not wired as well as it could be. Can you rewire a human brain? Yes, because the brain is neuroplastic. It's much harder when you're older, but yes, it's possible. And we see that again in these prison populations where people encounter things like mindfulness training, yoga, therapy, creativity, artwork, study, and people come out of those institutions, if those institutions are wholesome and therapeutically based, where they want to change their life and do something creative and wonderful in the world. Those kind of early years impacts change the way the brain works. So again, if you hear somebody say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger with regard to those early years, and they're probably talking nonsense. Okay, so we need challenges, the right challenges. We need to be able to build resilience, but in a really healthy, good way. So that's the second type of stress. So we've got environmental stress and developmental stress. The next one I want to look at is perceptual stress, and this one is where stress gets really interesting and actually very personal. Because perceptual stress is about how we see and interpret the world around us. Now, just imagine you've got a traffic jam. You've got several people in the same kind of situation, and two people can experience exactly the same situation, like a traffic jam, for example, or maybe being caught in a much more complex situation where there is, a higher level of threat or complexity. And when you see people here, you notice them having completely different reactions. One person might be cool, chilled, relaxed. Oh, well, this is happening. Let me do something. Another person might be ready to explode. They might be having temper tantrums. We see people going into fear responses, collapsed responses in sometimes of stress situations, and others managing it really well. There are so many different ways to respond to these complex situations. And the difference here is perception and learning, because it's how your brain processes the situation. It's also the stories you tell yourself about what's happening. What does it mean to me? What kind of impact is it having? And we push ourselves and the possibilities into the future, and the story we tell ourselves, what the potential outcome is in the future, then impacts directly our experience. So here it is. A lot of the ways we do stress as adults come from what we learned growing up. We learn to do stress from our parents, our caregivers, and our culture. So whoever our significant caregivers are, whatever our culture says about stress, about managing situations, that's what we replicate, most likely. Now, this kind of perceptual stress feels real because it triggers a chain reaction in our body called the stress cascade. And the stress cascade is like a domino in effect, and it is super quick. It has to be super quick simply because in a survival situation in nature, going back to kind of hunter-gatherer type lifestyle, if something is chasing you and about to eat you, you need to run, and you need to run now, immediately. Yeah. Or you need to climb a tree or do whatever it is, the response that's required, but you need to do it right now. So this cascade is a super rapid domino effect in the system. And from perceptual stress, it's not necessarily about an environmental trigger. It's from a stressful thought. It's from a stressful story you just tell yourself. And what happens then is your body tenses up, your breathing changes, stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, potentially flood your system. And this makes your brain even more reactive. And in that reactivity, you no longer have access to clear thinking. You can't make rational choices. You only have access to the habits that you have learnt. So that kind of situation then spirals you into a vicious cycle. But here's the good news. Perceptual stress is something we can work with because we can train our attention using tools like breathwork, using tools like mind training, using body-based tools. We can literally rewire how we respond to triggers. We can catch the trigger, feel the trigger, and then do something about it after the trigger is kicked off, or preferably beforehand. We can feel the arising energy of that trigger coming into place. We learn how to be with our triggers, and we can change our own situation, change our own perspective, rewire our own brain with what I call self-applied neuroplasticity. Now, we're going to dig into this much, much deeper in future episodes. But know this first of all. You can actually teach your brain and body to shift from stress to ease. And that is what a lot of, traditional meditative mind training, mindfulness-based practice is about. It's about learning to relax into life and enjoy your life. Actually enjoy your life, whatever's happening. So how do we do this? Let's start thinking about this, okay? So let's start with an idea which I'm going to call pattern interruption, okay? Because stress, like I said, isn't something that just happens to you. It's a loop. It's a set of patterns inside your brain and body that your brain and body has learned over time. It's a pattern. It's a cascade. It's one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, leads to another thing. So if we can interrupt that pattern and say, oh, stop that, and we can do with the right tools, we can then interrupt those and create new ones. And that, in essence, is the process of learning. And that starts from pattern interruption. Again, this is based on neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. Now, there's a saying in neuroscience, neurons that fire together, wire together, and neurons that fire apart, wire apart. And what that means is that, if the trigger leads to a cascade all the time, then that will continue to happen. If they fire apart, they wire apart. That means we interrupted, something else has to happen. So every time we interrupt a stress response and shift our attention towards something else, maybe something calmer, maybe something easier, something different, we're literally rewiring our brain. Now, this, of course, is where profound practices like awareness of breathing come in, because we're building a habit into the body of shifting attention from the stories in the brain, which are particular parts of the brain called the default mode network, but we're shifting attention from that onto something else, and we're learning that habit and embodying that habit. And in the embodiment of that habit, we are building the power to shift out of the apprehensive, complex, difficult narratives we're creating, and then rewire and do something else. So breathwork is one of the most powerful tools we have for this kind of self-applied neuroplasticity, because it helps us to break the familiar grooves of stress and carve out new pathways for ease and resilience. Now, over time, with disciplined repetition, because like I say, these habits, they're not habits to begin with, they're just things we do, but they have to become embodied. They have to become habits that we have access to when we are in the stress cascade of adrenaline. And this rewiring can then transform how we experience stress, both in the moment and over the long term. So it's not just about feeling good. It's about protecting our well-being and health, because stress impacts everything. It impacts how our mitochondria, the energy powerhouses of our cells, and they are much more than that, by the way. We'll go into mitochondria later, okay? But it affects how the mitochondria works, therefore it affects how much life energy we have for maintaining cells, for looking after our body. It affects how much energy we have for living well. Mitochondria directly impact the immune system. They affect directly. They release small parts of mtDNA into the system, and that then changes immune function. It affects metabolism and how everything works. If we impact the mitochondria through stress, we affect everything. And we know full well that stress over time leads to earlier onset conditions such as cardiovascular disorder, cancer, dementia, diabetes. So all those kind of conditions that are often related to aging come on earlier because of the impact of stress. So when we start to look after ourselves, we are doing well-being training as well. We're really looking after ourselves. Now, many, many people who struggle with stress as adults, people caught in cycles of overwhelm, and like I said, those in the criminal justice or social care system, have histories of developmental stress that compromise their ability to manage stress when they were young, that then impacts later in life. Now, breathwork can be a game changer in the necessary restorative work for these individuals, amongst many other skills as well. Breathwork is not a panacea. Let me say that clear. Breathwork is not a panacea. Breathwork has to go with mind training, it has to go with body training, it probably has to go with skilled therapy, and many other aspects of practice to make it functional. There is no panacea. We're looking at changing the orientation, the structure, the rewiring of a lifelong experience into something new. And there isn't a panacea for that. There's steady, disciplined, engaged work, embodied work of training how we operate. There is a kind of stress, though, called eustress, which is the good kind of stress. That's a really good one, okay? So before we dive into the stress cascade, let's talk about eustress a little bit, because it's good stuff. And it's the kind of challenge that feels exciting, rewarding, pleasurable. And if you think about, tackling a big project you're passionate about, you really want to do it, and you've got that kind of a mix of adrenaline and dopamine. Adrenaline is the stress mediator. It creates the stress response, but dopamine is anticipation and reward. And you can get these different cocktails of hormones going there. So instead of just being adrenaline and fear, it's adrenaline and dopamine, and maybe some other good neurochemicals as well, like a bit of serotonin in there. Serotonin is the joy transmitter. So the thrill of tackling a big project that you're passionate about might well be one of those things where you get that cocktail of hormones going on and you feel, you want to do this. You know, the flow state is another one where you're into something. Maybe you're gardening, maybe you're climbing a mountain, whatever it is that gets you into the flow state when you're fully immersed in something you love. In fact, you're so immersed in it, you forget about who you are and you are just that thing. That's the flow state. And coming to that, that is good. That's eustress. We create eustress by doing things like a yoga practice or going down the gym. You know, where you're stressing your body, you're doing something to give yourself challenges that lead you to feeling better. So it's when we get these cocktails of hormones going on that we get this eustress. Dopamine fuels motivation and reward. Serotonin, the joy or the happiness chemical. And we get endorphins and endocannabinoids, which bring feelings of bliss and peace and relaxation. And we get something called GABA, which calms the nervous system. And maybe even a little bit of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is the psychedelic molecule that some people say you release in deep breathwork states. It's a bit complicated, that one, because we have very little evidence for it in the human body. But the thing is that with practices like breathwork, you can tap into this endogenous harmony. Endogenous means made on the inside. We're not taking the pharmaceuticals in from the outside. That's exogenous. We're taking them in we're making them on the inside. We're making dopamine. We're making serotonin. We're understanding how to sustain dopamine levels, because dopamine, we can get thresholds, for example, where we have to, it gets complicated. It's not as simple as just keeping it going. We have to find ways to reset dopamine thresholds. But dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, endocannabinoids, GABA, DMT, all this fantastic internal endogenous pharmacy. And we can work with this. And when we're working with breath work and mind training and embodiment, this is the internal pharmacy within you, waiting to be accessed, waiting to be used. It is amazing. So let's have a look at the stress cascade, when stress takes over. And this is the chain reaction of psychological, physiological, and behavioral events that unfolds whenever we encounter something that we find stressful, whether it's environmental, triggered by developmental journeys, whether it's perceptual, or even extreme eustress where it pushes us over the edge. Remember, it all starts with perception. Perception, of course, is impacted by brain development. So it depends on how our brain is developed as to how our perception, what we see, how we see situations will be. But the moment your brain detects something as threatening, or even just challenging, a cascade of activity begins. And this process starts deep in the brain, areas like the amygdala, your brain's watchdog. The amygdala is like a blind watchdog or a half-blind watchdog. It barks, it kicks off as soon as anything appears stressful. And when it kicks off like that, it interrupts the flow of information from the body, and everything comes up through the body, through the brain. So it interrupts that flow of information. And then the parts of the brain that go, let me think about this, can't operate. We don't have that capacity then to be able to think clearly about it. We just go into the body habits. So it starts deep in the brain. In fact, it runs through the amygdala. It goes through the hypothalamus, which connects your brain and the endocrine system, all the glands in the body, all the autonomic nervous system. That's all the things in your body and mind that you never think about, like your digestion, your breathing, blood gas levels, blood acidity, everything at a cellular level, all the things that you never have to think about, how your body works. That's run by the autonomic nervous system in conjunction with the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is all the glands that run metabolism. And of course, two of those, the adrenal glands, kick off adrenaline. They make adrenaline and cortisol as well. So when this stress trigger hits and we get a perception of stress, then it goes through the amygdala, through the hypothalamus, and from those signals shoot down your autonomic nervous system, your adrenal glands, and they're on top of your kidneys, by the way, and those glands release adrenaline straight away. And if you've ever experienced that, you can notice it, you feel it in your body. It's like a hot, sharp spike of tension like that. And the stress response kicks in straight away. And that impact is immediate, and it affects every single cell in your body, every single cell in your brain. So it is an emergency response system. It prepares you to run, to fight, or respond in some way to survive. And it does so many things. It speeds up your heart rate. You might notice that. It opens your airways and increases your breathing rate. It often makes breathing more up here in the chest. Sometimes it makes it oral, in and out through your mouth. It dumps glucose, that's sugar, which is the fuel for the brain and fuel for the cells, into your blood, so your muscles are ready for action, which is great if you have to act, but not if you're just sitting around at an office, because then you're increasing blood glucose levels and you're heading towards diabetes. It diverts blood away from digestion towards your muscles and brain, which is great if you're running, but not if you've just eaten and you need to digest and access those, minerals and those components from digestion. It sharpens your vision and hearing. It takes you into this kind of hyper-alert state. And interestingly, it reduces pain sensitivity as well, which is why something like cortisol is often used for pain and also for inflammation. Adrenaline is the perfect hormone for outrunning or trying to outrun a lion. In fact, human beings are actually quite slow. The fastest human being is about 28 miles an hour. Usain Bolt and hyenas can run at about 48 miles an hour. So it's very tricky for a human being to outrun a predator. The best situation is to climb a tree. But moving fast, it's perfect for that. It's perfect for surviving that meeting with your boss as long as you can stay calm. But here's the catch. Adrenaline is dose dependent. Too much adrenaline for too long, it can mess with your cognitive function. Like I said, it shuts down the prefrontal cortex, so it makes it harder to think, harder to be creative, harder to come up with a new solution, and harder to make good decisions. So even small doses, if repeated over time, can lead to chronic stress. And adrenaline sticks around in your system for up to 6 hours. So if you get a squirt of adrenaline released through the adrenal glands, it hangs around for 6 hours. That's right, 6 whole hours where you're in that state. If you don't resolve it, you can resolve it through movement, running, by moving, by doing some kind of breath work or by doing some calming practice. You can start to alter that adrenaline cascade slightly in different ways, depending on what you do. But the thing is that, that adrenaline state can become a new normal for your body, keeping you stuck in a state of stress, a state of hypervigilance, a state of being on the edge. And of course, that then has complexities because you're living in a state where your digestion isn't going to work as well, your breathing is altered, your brain perceptual patterns are altered. So it becomes very complicated. Now, when we get, the first wave of stress, adrenaline, what comes in after that, eventually with long-term stress, is cortisol. And that's released after about 15 minutes of sustained stress. So it's not that long. But cortisol helps your body to stay on high alert for longer. It marshals the resources of your body ready to stay in that state. Okay? If you've ever experienced high cortisol, it increases blood sugar again to fuel your brain and your muscles, which again is great if you are in a stressful situation and you are highly active. But if you're just sitting at a desk and doing work and you've got lots of blood sugar going around, you can see that is going to lead towards diabetes. It breaks down fat and protein to create more energy, which is great again in that situation, but not if you're just in a work domain. It suppresses inflammation at first, so that gives you the capacity to stay moving, stay active, and it keeps your blood pressure elevated. Now again, blood pressure elevated when you're running away from something, or you're fighting or doing some of that, great stuff. But if you're just sitting down living your life in a quiet way and you have elevated blood pressure, that is going to lead to complexity. Sustained cortisol levels leads to fatigue, headaches, poor immune function, weight gain, increased blood pressure, anxiety, depression, irritability, chronic illnesses like heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, and dementia. Early onset dementia. Earlier onset dementia, it's often, there are many different aspects, genetic aspects and so forth as well, but it is one of the variables that can lead to an early onset degeneration of brain function. One of the subtler aspects of cortisol is its impact on breathing. It leads you to shallow, fast breathing, often oral, a state the Buteyko method calls overbreathing. the oxygen advantage, also call it overbreathing. And this further disrupts your body's balance, pushing you deeper into the stress loop. If you're breathing fast and oral, in and out through the mouth and up in the chest here, you're going to be pushing carbon dioxide out your blood. And pushing carbon dioxide out your blood, there's a thing called the Bohr effect, which is the way that the hemoglobin, the red pigment in your blood cells, which carries oxygen, is impacted by a reduction in blood carbon dioxide, in as much as it cannot then release the oxygen. It's binding. It's holding oxygen, taking around the body. And if you breathe like that, it can't release oxygen. So you're deoxygenating your brain and your heart, your liver and your kidneys. Now, of course, if you're deoxygenating your brain and your heart, that's going to lead to a problem, because the brain and the heart need lots of oxygen to run well. They really do. So if you're breathing in that kind of way, you're going to impact and harm the function of your heart and your brain over time. Well, that's it so far. We've looked at 3 big types of stress: environmental, developmental, and perceptual. We've seen how stress takes hold in the body, from the initial adrenaline rush to the longer-term effects of cortisol. So in our next episode, we'll dig into practical strategies for breaking the stress cycle, starting with breath work, because it's so useful and it's very accessible if we practice it, that is. Remember, these things have to become habits in the body. But I'll show you how to use your breath, and also how to use your mind to regulate your nervous system, reset your stress response, and tap into your body's natural pharmacy of calm, resilience, joy, and actually feeling good. And if you've ever caught yourself overthinking, spiraling, feeling stuck in stress, I've got your back, because we're going to show you how to do this. In future episodes, we'll break down practical strategies to build resilience, to master your mind, and use your breath to take back control. Because in the modern world, which is volatile, unpredictable, chaotic at times, it feels it's an interesting time to live in. We live in interesting times. And the capacity to use our body-based skills to have some semblance and feeling of control is potent. It gives us the edge. So that's what we're looking for, and that's what we aim to give you. Help you to find that for yourself. So thanks for listening to EMBODY, Mastering Body, Breath and Mind. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share it with a friend, and until next time, keep breathing easy.